A look at the SG-1000's difficult childhood here on episode 5 of Segaiden. As we've seen across the likes of Famicom, Game Boy, Nintendo 64, and Game Boy Color, every vintage Japanese console launched with a specific lineup of games based around popular real-world pastimes in Japan: baseball, Go, Shogi, and Mahjong.
The one exception is Virtual Boy, which only received a baseball game, and a terrible one at that. But otherwise, this was a hard and fast rule of the industry, as reliable as the mascot platformer. And it all began here, and on Famicom, back in 1983. Just as Famicom's first two post-launch titles were conversions of Go and Mahjong, so too did SG-1000 get its own board game adaptations of Mahjong and Shogi right out of the gate. As a wise cavewoman once said, "Rule of life, no change rule."
SG-1000 catalog number G1004, Mahjong, is notable for two reasons. First, it's the first game for the system not based around an arcade conversion. Secondly, it's the first game developed for the system internally at Sega's offices. Unlike Borderline, Safari Hunting, and InSub, Mahjong wasn't converted to the system from the VicDual arcade system, and it also wasn't ported by Compile.
However, that's about all that makes Mahjong for SG-1000 unique. This adaptation of the popular tile-matching game is almost completely identical to the Mahjong Nintendo released for Famicom about a month and a half after those two systems launched. Since Sega doesn't provide formal release dates for its SG-1000 games beyond the year in which they debuted, it's impossible to say whether this or Nintendo's is the first ever console Mahjong game, but they're both pretty much the same thing and they both pretty much debuted at the same time, so let's call the whole thing off. Now, when I say they're pretty much the same thing, this is not some snide, xenophobic, hand-waving dismissal of another culture's pastime. Like Mahjong for Famicom, the SG-1000 game does not properly recreate the full tabletop Mahjong experience, limiting its play features to a single-player competition against a single computer-powered opponent rather than offering multiplayer support or a proper four-position face-off. This is based around the Japanese Reichi rule variant of the Chinese game, and can feel pretty opaque if you don't know the requirements of the game. Specifically, you're trying to create a collection of tile matches falling under one of several different categories. These are actually fairly analogous to poker sets: identical face values, consecutive runs within the same suit of tiles, that sort of thing. Adding to the complexity, however, players need to declare the kind of match they've created, which is where I always trip up with these games.
That's right.
Given the formality of the game Mahjong adapts and the limitations of what could be accomplished within the SG-1000's limited memory space, there's honestly not too much to say about this version. Again, it plays almost exactly like Famicom Mahjong, though its visuals are somewhat more primitive and its interface is slightly more awkward. As with Nintendo's game, this seems like a perfunctory bid to appeal to older consumers, who of course were the ones spending money on a game console in 1983. It's a familiar topic that one could play without needing to round up a bunch of friends or manage a bunch of tiles. And if it feels like only half a proper Mahjong experience, well, remember that in 1983 it had novelty going for it. A quick and easy way to play digital Mahjong on a device that cost far less than the home computers of the era. It's aged horribly, but then this wasn't exactly created as a bid for historic posterity, you know?
Date ambiguity aside, there's no question that Sega beat Nintendo to the punch with this next title, Champion Golf for SG-1000. Unfortunately for this game, it arrived just a little too early for its own good, as the video game golf genre wouldn't coalesce into its true final form until the following year.
1984 saw the debut of Golf for Famicom, co-created by Nintendo and HAL Labs, and Ayako Okamoto's Match Play Golf for the Othello Multivision clone of the SG-1000, which was developed by Sakuda Original. Both of those cartridges play a lot more like what we think of as the modern-day golf video game, with swing meters and on-course aiming. Champion Golf kind of has all those things, but they all feel like they're prototypical forms here. This is a game that almost gets everything right, but not quite. Champion Golf is the first game for SG-1000 to display a developer credit besides Sega. This was originally created for home computers, including the MSX, which also debuted in 1983 alongside the SG-1000 and Famicom, by a company called Logitech. That's Logitech with no H. This Logitech is a long-defunct Japanese microcomputer developer, not a manufacturer of gaming and computer peripherals. Logitech deserves credit for almost figuring out how to make golf video games work. They came so close. Champion Golf works in the broad strokes, as it were, but it just can't sink the putt. Where Champion Golf trips up is in its interface, but since the interface is about 90% of a golf game, that's a big problem. It offers a more robust simulation of the sport than the golf games seen on earlier consoles like Atari 2600, which all amounted basically to hit the ball in a direction and hope for the best. Here you have two different views, the course overview and the putting green, a simulation of wind velocity, and different ball reactions based on your choice of club. There's even almost a kind of recreation of course topography around the green. However, the interface for determining the direction of your swing is very strange here. You take aim by moving your caddy around the perimeter of the screen, with the goal being to create a line between the ball and the caddy that passes through the cup, with, of course, some variance to adjust to the direction and force of the wind. It's pretty inefficient since your caddy always moves around the outer boundaries of the screen. You can jump immediately to the opposite side of the screen, but cornering takes a little while. It's a trivial inconvenience, but it adds up over the course of the game. Similarly, Champion Golf does have a swing meter, but it feels just a little too clumsy for its own good. Rather than taking the form of a simple bar that rises and falls, the swing meter appears as a representation of your golfer, and you vary the power of a stroke based on where in his swing you press the button. Somewhat counterintuitively, you need to press the button as your golfer is making his initial wind-up rather than during the actual swing. I guess the idea is that the timing of your action determines the amount of strength you put into the swing, but the actual mapping of timing to results seems pretty wildly inconsistent. It's harder to hit the perfect timing for this visual representation than it is for a simple linear bar-style meter. And even once you get a feel for how the mechanic works in general, executing it with any consistency can be bizarrely difficult. You're practically guaranteed to fumble endlessly as you attempt to come in under par, and the more minute the play you need to execute, the harder it becomes to pull it off. Tiny little putts that are a can't-miss proposition in other golf games are an exercise in absolute frustration here. Champion Golf is a noble early attempt at interpreting the sport in video game form, but the world wouldn't see a truly excellent and intuitive golf game until the following year.
Speaking of 1984, Champion Golf is the first of the original SG-1000 titles that would be converted to the Sega MyCard format for the SG-1000 Mark II release. But that is a topic for a future episode. We've had Mahjong, now here's one of the other inevitabilities of a Japanese console launch. A shogi game. We've seen shogi games on N64 Works and Game Boy Works, but if I'm not mistaken, Serizawa Hachidan Tsumishogi is the very first console version of Mahjong ever released.
But this is even less of a proper simulation of the tabletop pastime than even Mahjong was. At least that offered a full match, albeit one without enough competitors. Serizawa Hachidan no Tsumishogi, or Tsumishogi for short, does not attempt to recreate the entirety of a shogi match. That might simply have been an impossibility given the storage and working memory capacity of this platform at launch. Shogi gives chess a run for its money in terms of complexity, and until more powerful consoles and chips with elaborate subprocessors entered the picture, shogi games were strained, to say the least. Instead, Tsumishogi is more of a puzzle game in which players are given play scenarios to solve. You can choose from a series of easy, advanced, or expert situations, and your task is simply to make the correct moves to safely maneuver your pieces out of a jam and put the opponent's pieces into jeopardy. We saw something like this as a secondary mode in Saikyo Habushogi for Nintendo 64, and this is pretty similar to that, although less pretty. It is pretty vexing, however. I would have to describe it as vexing. Even after reading up on the pieces and their legal moves, I still can't seem to beat even the most basic puzzle here. Tsumishogi won't let you make illegal moves, and it seems to restrict many moves that seem like they should be legal, but it will let you make fatal mistakes and lose a round. I'm afraid I'm just too thick-witted for this game. But according to the blog Sega Does, the Serizawa in the title seems to be a reference to an early 80s shogi pro named Hirobumi Serizawa, and Hachidan means 8th level Dan, basically the highest possible ranking a professional shogi player can earn. So I don't feel so bad about my complete failure to function at this game. After all, I'm up against the world's greatest shogi player, while I can even barely remember what the pieces are. Anyway, this is an interesting attempt to provide the SG-1000 with another one of those real-world analogs, though it doesn't really work.
On the other hand, at least Tsumishogi works better than Sega's adaptation of minor arcade hit Congo Bongo. Not to put too fine a point on it, but this version is a disaster.
Of all the games for Sega to fumble, this really wasn't it. Congo Bongo should have been a Donkey Kong killer, considering the two games shared legacy and similar themes. But if Nintendo stumbled a bit at bringing Donkey Kong to Famicom by dropping one of the game's 4 stages, Sega basically fell off a cliff and died halfway down with this cartridge. Now, maybe that's not a fair comparison. After all, according to Nathan Altus's book I Am Error, The Famicom hardware was specifically designed to recreate Donkey Kong as accurately as possible on a home console. Aside from the lost cement factory stage, the expurgated cinematic transitions, and the slight vertical compression of the visuals resulting from the move to a horizontal aspect ratio from the arcade's Tate mode layout, Donkey Kong on Famicom and NES was an impressive feat. It looked, played, and sounded more like the arcade version than any other home release to that point. Sega's own version of Congo Bongo does not. It omits not one but two stages from the arcade release, and on top of that, the stages that do make it onto this cartridge are, shall we say, troubled. A bit of history here. The arcade version of Congo Bongo was produced by an electronics firm called Ikegami Tsushinki. Ikegami, which is still around and making high-end broadcast equipment, had previously been Nintendo's go-to for arcade board development. While Nintendo staff did the creative development work on games like Radarscope, Popeye, and, yes, Donkey Kong, Ikegami handled the actual engineering to make the boards work. This was the era of custom arcade boards, and connecting with Ikegami gave Nintendo a real technical edge. Their early 80s arcade hardware was some of the most impressive to be found at the time, with excellent graphical capabilities and powerful sound generation features. Donkey Kong ended up becoming a massive hit, a success on a far greater scale than Nintendo ever imagined. According to several different accounts, Nintendo responded to the game's popularity by quickly producing more arcade boards to meet demand. Now, the details here are imprecise, but it appears Ikegami, who coded and designed these boards, took exception to Nintendo's decision since they didn't see any additional profit from these new boards. Nintendo then supposedly reverse-engineered Ikegami's work to create Donkey Kong Jr. internally, further profiting off the contractor's labor. Now, the exact details of all of this are vague, given that it was mostly handled in a legal case resolved out of court in another country. But in any case, a year later, Sega had a curiously Donkey Kong-like game called Congo Bongo in arcades, and Ikegami's logo appears in the code, so make of it what you will. Now, Congo Bongo was not as good a game as Donkey Kong, but it looked far more impressive. It left behind Donkey Kong's simple 2D platforming in favor of a faux 3D perspective using isometric graphics. This made for more convoluted gameplay that could prove more difficult to master due to the visual ambiguity it introduced, but it sure made quite an impression. And as with Donkey Kong, Congo Bongo took place over 4 distinct stages, each of which introduced new challenges and objectives over the previous stages. It was a pretty cool looking game, and it showed up on a fair few computer and console platforms in the early 80s in varying degrees of fidelity. The SG-1000 release, for Sega's own console, bizarrely stands as the least faithful looking of them all. It's the sole home adaptation of Congo Bongo to abandon any sense of dimensionality. Rather than attempting to emulate the arcade's isometric visuals, this Congo Bongo is a mostly 2D game seen from a sort of top-down perspective. This is not a limitation of the hardware. The MSX and ColecoVision versions of the game, which run on hardware nearly identical to that of the SG-1000, both manage a fairly convincing isometric viewpoint. Sega's own SG-1000 port of Zaxxon, which ran on Congo Bongo's hardware in arcades, would emulate the proper arcade perspective. So who really knows what happened here? Were Sega's programmers simply not confident in their handling of the console yet, even though it was highly identical to the big dual arcade hardware they'd been using for half a decade? Did they feel the game would be more streamlined and accessible without its most appealing feature? Was this simply a compromise to save storage space? I sure hope it wasn't that last one, because if so, the effort fell flat on its face. Congo Bongo drops 2 of the arcade's 4 stages, resulting in a home conversion that's simply half the game. You get the iconic first stage, in which you climb a series of ridges and bridges in order to ascend a mountain where your nemesis, the diabolical gorilla Congo Bongo, waits. And you get the snakes and hippos level, in which you need to dodge serpents and cross logs in order to reach the far shore where Congo Bongo has escaped. But that's it. Once you complete those 2 stages, the game just takes you back to the cliffs level, and everything repeats, getting a little faster each time. It's a massive letdown for me here in 2021, as Congo Bongo is one of those games I remember seeing as a kid but never having a chance to play. As an adult, I always jump at any opportunity to spend time with this Tantallian work of my youth. But whatever the heck it was that Sega decided to dish up here, it is not the Congo Bongo sensation that I crave.
You can only imagine how much more of a letdown it would have been for anyone who bought this game back in 1983 expecting anything like an actual arcade port. Sure, Congo Bongo is no Donkey Kong, but it still deserves better than this. Next on Segaiden, we continue working through the SG-1000's early years with more shootin' and more sportin'.